Good morning. I hope all of you are having a good Sunday. My name is Bradley Erickson, and this is Introduction to Apologetics live stream Sunday school class. This is our third time trying out this live stream thing during the crisis, so hopefully it goes well. We don't have a lot of issues. We'll go ahead and get started with some housekeeping. First of all, there's a handout at the link. You can also get it in the description. This is basically an outline of the class if you want to take notes or go back and review some things later. And then the second link is a app that allows you to join a discussion online on a phone or in a web browser and share your comments or ask questions and get notifications about future classes. And then I want to also show you, in case you're new to this whole live streaming thing, this is how you can access the chat room. So when you are looking at the class, there is a live chat button right here in the middle. You click that and it will expand a chat box, and you just type your message in there. There is about a 30-second delay, so I won't see the messages right away, but I do encourage you to ask questions right when you have them, and then at the end of the class I will address those questions that have come up. And then also, if you're looking for direct links to the handout or to the GroupMe, you can click this little arrow to expand the description box of the video, and there are links there that you can just click directly in your browser. Let me know if you have any issues with those links. So last week we continued discussing the arguments for the existence of God. We covered the Leibniz's contingency argument and the teleological argument, which is an argument from the fine-tuning of the universe, the design of the universe. And so this week we're going to continue this discussion. We're going to look at the ontological argument and the moral argument. Like I've said in the past, these are not all of the arguments for God. There's dozens more. But these are some of the most popular ones, and as an intro class, we're just barely scratching the surface on all of these. So I encourage you to look at the handout at the end. There are a number of resources that you can explore these and other arguments further, and there's a lot of work out there available for you to do that. I just want to open with this verse again today. For his invisible attributes, that is, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, being understood through what he has made. As a result, people are without excuse. Romans 1:20. So for us as Christians, we should expect to see things like these arguments. Okay, God's invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen since the creation of the world. We see them in nature. Okay, so this is an outflowing of that work of people for thousands of years now, thinking through the nature of reality and how it reflects God and the creator of that reality. So we're going to open this morning with the ontological argument. And ontology means the study of being. So it deals with concepts that relate to being, in particular becoming or existence, reality, and the basic categories of being and their relations. Okay, so this is one of the more hotly debated arguments of the five that we're covering, and it's one of the less used arguments. And that part of that is because the scope of the argument can be challenging to defend, and sometimes people find the argument difficult to understand. So if you aren't understanding it the first time through, don't feel bad. Sometimes it takes some work on this one to think through exactly what is going on here and what is being said by this argument. And one of the misunderstandings about this argument is that it claims to prove that God exists, and this is false. All the argument attempts to accomplish is to show that if the idea of God is not logically or metaphysically incoherent, if that idea is not irrational, then God does exist. And a lot of casual observers will hear this argument and think something seems fishy, like you're just thinking God into existence or something like that. And there's a lot of pop philosophical criticism of the argument out there. And so a lot of people, they hit it, they see the criticism, and then they just choose to ignore it altogether. But what is so interesting about this argument is that it relies on nothing other than logic to show that if the premises are true, then God must exist. So we're going to open with another video to kind of explain, hopefully quickly, what this argument is all about.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor or a square circle or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Okay, so sorry about that. I started the video, we didn't have the slides up, so it's one man show here, and sometimes you get going and you forget that there's a number of jobs that you need to be doing to make sure everyone can see everything. So I apologize about that, but we do have. Hopefully, you're seeing the slides now. So as the video mentioned, this argument was first in its early stages formulated by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, in 1078. And he was unhappy with the complexity of other arguments for the existence of God, and this is one of the arguments that he formulated. And he focused on this idea from Psalms 14:1a, that a fool says in his heart, there is no God. Okay, so Anselm's definition of God, the original definition is in Latin. I'm going to butcher it, but we're going to say it anyway. Aliquid quo nihil maius cogitari possit. So God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, or God is the greatest conceivable being. And he believed that once you understand the definition of God, then you'll see that God must exist. And if God did not exist, he would not be the greatest conceivable being. And so this is the more modern formulation of the ontological argument. And we're going to, just like we did with other arguments, kind of break through each premise and then the conclusion, just walk through it. So number one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Number two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Number three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. Number four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. And number five, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists, or God exists. And so, as they mentioned in the video, believe it or not, among professional philosophers, premises 2 through 5 are pretty incontrovertible. I know those are, I think, to those of us lay people, those feel the most awkward because we're talking about possible worlds, and it just seems like we're just coming up with something out of nothing there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as the video described. But really, in the greater world, it's actually the premise one is the most debated. So it is possible that a maximally great being exists. So this makes a true statement that can either be accepted or rejected. A claim is that it's possible that a maximally great being exists. And it's actually an interesting premise because a large number of atheists readily grant that it's possible for God to exist, but they just don't believe God exists. And so when we talk about a maximally great being, we kind of need to talk about that. What are great making properties? So Anselm suggests that God will only have great making properties and no less making properties. So here are the great making properties that we're going to talk about. He'd be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful, all-knowing, eternally good, eternally living, and all good. Conversely, the less making properties on that side would be that he would be bounded by time, bounded by space, bounded by matter, limitedly powerful, limited in knowledge, mortal, and somewhat good. And I think we as Christians can recognize on this left-hand column that those properties describe the God that we worship. And those are the great making properties that would describe a maximally great being. He would not be bound by time. He's not bound by space or by matter, because he has to be outside of the universe to create it. He's not limited in power, and he's not limited in knowledge. And then he doesn't die. He's not a mortal. And then the last one is he's all good. Okay, and then premise 2 states that if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Okay, so if you can have someone admit that, yeah, it's possible that God exists, well, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. So it basically restates premise 1 using a possible worlds vernacular. In fact, anything that is possible in some possible world by definition. And this helps make the rest of the argument easier to understand by having this premise. Now, possible worlds. A possible world is not another planet or a parallel dimension. It is used in logical arguments to describe the way reality could be. So if you've read the novel Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, he posits, for fiction's sake, a possible world where the Nazis in Japan did not lose World War II, but instead won, and they took over the United States. And the entire novel is about the ideas of kind of what would have happened if this had actually taken place. But we could also think about other theoretical possibilities. So maybe there's one where Lindsay and I enter the lottery and we are millionaires. That is possible that could have happened. And these examples are worlds which are plausibly true. They could plausibly exist. And according to this definition, a possible world cannot be an impossible world. Okay, so there cannot be any world in which the logically impossible objects exist. So for example, there cannot be a universe in which 2 equals 3, or there are 4-sided triangles, or like they talked about in the video, that there are married bachelors. Okay, these are our ideas are logically absurd, and so they cannot exist in any possible world. And so we just want to think about possible worlds are a tool to use in arguments to express ideas about the way reality could be, and it's used most often in modal logic. Okay, so that's where this possible worlds thing is coming from. It is a philosophical tool that we can use to theorize about the actual reality based on what is possible. So when we move to premise 3, that if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then a maximally great being exists in every possible world. Okay. So why is this the case? And the answer is in that definition of being maximally great. So if a creature, A, exists in only one possible world, that's good, because it exists. If a creature, B, exists in 2 possible worlds, well, that's even better. So the more worlds that a being exists in, the better the being is. So by this reasoning, we come to see that a maximally great being must be great maximally, and therefore must exist in all possible worlds. And that follows that if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world. Because our world is not only a possible world, but it is the actual world. Okay, so it's not just a possible world, it's the actual world that we live in. So a maximally great being exists in the actual world. And it follows that if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. This is kind of an obvious premise. And finally, we can state that therefore a maximally great being, or God, exists. Right? So this is a purely logic-based argument. And just thinking through this. Okay. Now we'll talk about some objections. Well, we're only really going to cover one there, but there are objections, more objections out there. I just don't have time to cover a number of them. But um, so because of this argument, most secular or atheistic philosophers find themselves forced into adopting the notion that it is impossible that God exists. Um, in order to hold this position with intellectual honesty, you must show in what way the very notion of God is logically incoherent. So you've got to show that the idea of God is logically incoherent in that case, because you have to show it's impossible for him to exist. Not if there's any possibility, it opens room in this argument that he does exist. So the major one I want to talk about is the omnipotent paradox. And you may have actually heard this, not necessarily in relation to this argument directly, but just in general. It's one of those things if you've been around long enough, you've probably heard someone say it. And it goes something like this, maybe. Can God create a rock so big that even he cannot lift it? And then they'll argue, if he cannot create the rock, then he is not omnipotent. If he can create the rock and cannot lift it, he is not omnipotent either. So they feel like the argument kind of tries to pin you into, well, the idea of God's omnipotence is logically incoherent. But when we actually examine the argument, this is a straw man argument. So we talked about fallacies 2 lessons ago. And a straw man is a form of argument and an informal fallacy based on giving the impression of refuting an opponent's argument while actually refuting an argument that was not presented by that opponent. One who engages in this fallacy is said to be attacking a straw man. So another example of this would be if a child asks their parent, "Can we get a dog?" And the parent says, "No." And then the child argues it would protect our home, and the parent still disagrees. "Sorry, we're not getting that dog, Rowan." And then the child comes back. "Why do you want to leave us and our house unprotected?" Okay, so this is a straw man argument about getting the dog. The parent didn't offer that reasoning that they didn't want to protect the home, but the child's offering it up as an accusation that's what the parent wants to avoid doing. So how does this apply when we're coming to the discussion of God, and how is this a straw man argument? So nowhere does the idea of being maximally great make the promise that a maximally great being can do logically absurd things. And this is something as Christians that we absolutely believe. We believe there are things God cannot do. Right? And at first blush, it makes you feel like, wait, what? God can't do something? But the Bible talks a bit about this. God cannot lie. God is not tempted with sin. God cannot break a promise. God can't sin. So we're already saying there are things that God cannot do because his nature is all good. He cannot do evil. And so trying to trap him in this idea of an incoherent idea of omnipotence doesn't work in this case. Maximally great beings must be self-consistent as part of being maximally great. Doing things that are logically absurd is not consistent with a maximally logical being. Therefore, God is omnipotently capable to living consistent with his own character. All right, and that's how we get around this argument. All right, so that's it for the ontological argument. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat, and we will get them to the end. So if something's churning you and you're like, well, what about this? We can discuss it, or you can get on the GroupMe afterwards throughout the week and ask questions about that. The last argument we're looking at in this series of arguments is the moral argument. And really, we're asking the question, can we be good without God? Okay. And the question is, I want to be clear about this, especially if you're sharing this with someone else. Can we be good without God? The question is not, can we recognize objective moral values and duties without believing in God? Instead, it is asking the question, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? Okay, and it seems like not that big of a distinction, but it's actually a very huge distinction. And we'll talk a little bit about that pushback towards the end of the argument. But first, we got another quick video.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed His moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in His command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because He is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Okay, so William Sorley was a philosopher. He lived from 1855 to 1935. And in 1918, he presented a lecture called Moral Values and the Idea of God. And this developed the most sophisticated version of the moral argument prior to our day. He argued that the best hope for a rational, unified view of reality is to postulate God as the ground of both the natural and moral orders. So he maintained that there's objective moral order, which is real and independent of us, as is the natural order of things. Just like we assume the natural order based on our experience, we can assume the moral order based on our moral experience. And this is the moral argument. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And we'll break this down. So in the first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So let's talk about some definitions here. Values have to do with whether something is good or bad, whereas duties have to do with whether something is right or wrong. Moral values refers to the worth of a person or action, and a moral duty refers to our obligation to act in a certain way. Duty is what you ought or ought not to do. So the differentiator here, because you might think, well, good is the same as right and bad is the same as wrong, but for these definitions, we're making a distinction. Because you would not be morally obligated to do something just because it would be good for you to do it. So it might be good for you to become a doctor, but you're not morally obligated to do so. Because it also might be good for you to be a farmer or a lawyer or a scientist or a homemaker. These things could all be good, but there is no moral obligation there for you to do them. Being a doctor versus a lawyer. And then the other term we want to address here is objective. So in this case, objective means that it's independent of people's opinions. And the inverse would be subjective, which means that it's dependent on people's opinions. And we talked about objective and subjective a little bit during our worldview section when we were discussing relativism. This premise really makes us ask the question, what is the basis of our values? Okay, so is it social convention, personal preference, evolution, or God? Maybe there's others that you add to this list, but let's talk about a few of these. So social convention. Sometimes you also hear people talking about cultural morals. So are values and duties based on just social convention, what society expects of us? Is that enough grounding for us to live our lives truly morally? And I think with a little bit of discussion, we can make most people admit that no, social convention is not enough. At one time, according to social convention, it was acceptable to own a slave in America. Okay, for a certain portion of the country, that was a social convention that was acceptable. Or when you look back and criticize another culture, say like the Nazis, that's an easy target. Were they wrong? A lot of them, a good majority of them, thought they were in the right. They thought that their social conventions were correct and that the things that they were doing were good and right because of their society. But when our society looks at them and we judge them, right? We say they were morally wrong. It was apprehensible, the things that they did. Okay, so that means that we can't ground our moral values in social convention because we have two cultures that disagree. Well, who's the arbitrator between those two? Is it just opinion? And so you could push someone on this and say, is it really just our society that determines what is truly right and wrong? And on a more granular level, personal preference. You'll have people say, well, you can get it. You hear a lot. What's good for everyone? Just everyone do your own thing. It's whatever is best for you, and you can hear that kind of relativism in our society today. Um, but then they'll always usually tack on something at the end, kind of like, well, as long as you don't hurt anyone. Okay, well, now they've tacked on an absolute. They've tacked on to that a objective absolute. So, I'm all about relativism as long as you don't hurt someone. Okay, but that's an absolute. So what is the grounding for that absolute? Because it can't be personal preference, because you and I already disagree on what is right and wrong, and who is going to arbitrate between us. Okay, and who are we obligated to, and what is the standard for that? And then another grounding that you might hear is evolution or naturalism. That we've evolved these moral instincts as a survival mechanism. Okay, and then it's just helping our species to perpetuate further. So they're just things that have evolved. But that's also not a grounding, okay, because we have other instincts that, if you take evolution to be true, that compete with one another. Okay, so you might be extremely tired and need to sleep, but you're being hunted down, so you actually need to stay awake and run for your life. These are competing instincts. Which instinct is stronger? Which takes precedence? And if moral values are just instincts, they could be overridden. They have no grounding. And then another idea that you have to address is speciesism. What makes the human species greater than any other species on the earth? What makes our moral values more of a standard than, say, a praying mantis that might eat its mate after they mate, or other species like bees that will kill off, the queens will kill off other females to maintain it. These, as they talked about in the video, these things aren't wrong for the animal to do. They're just being the animal. Whereas, if we kill our mates, or if we murder our descendants, it is wrong. So what makes us different? What under that that line of reasoning makes us different versus all of the animals out there? So under any of these options, moral values don't really exist. They're just illusions for human beings. Nothing can be right or wrong on any of these options. And entailed in this also is that humans are just animals, and animals don't have moral obligations to one another. So a lion doesn't murder a zebra, it kills it. So why, under this view, do we not just we don't have values, but why do we have a moral obligation to do anything? Another line of reasoning that could fit under all three of these that you might hear is human flourishing. It's all about human flourishing. But this is a very arbitrary stopping point. Okay, why think that what is conductive to human flourishing is any more valuable than what's conductive to grasshoppers or birds? Why think that inflicting harm on another member of our species is wrong? So this was also addressed in the video, but you might have somebody come back at you with the Euthyphro dilemma. And this is a dilemma named after a character in one of Plato's dialogues, so it's been around a very long time. And it's one objection to the grounding of moral values and duties in God. And it goes kind of something like this. Is something good because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? So if you think about this dilemma for a minute, if something is good because God wills it, then good becomes arbitrary. So God could change his mind and hate could become good, or lying could become good, and that's just because God willed it. But then on the other side, you're left with a choice of does God will something because it is good? Okay, the problem with this one is now good or bad is independent of God. And then the standard for good is outside of God, and this contradicts our premise one. But in reality, this is actually a false dilemma. It's actually a trilemma. There's a third horn we can pick, and that is God wills something because he is good. So it's God's own nature is the standard of goodness. Okay, and that gets us, we can get out of that dilemma because God is good. And he's not going to do something contrary to his nature, so he's not arbitrary. But also good and bad are not independent of him. He is the standard, he is the measure of good and evil. So our second premise is objective moral values and duties do exist. Okay, so despite the relativism and universalism, most people affirm this in some fashion. So even if the only thing they'll affirm is that it is right that one should tolerate other people's views, at that point they've admitted that there is an objective standard, right? They're saying, well, I believe that everyone should be able to make their own decisions and not tell each other what is good and bad. But what they're doing there is they're saying that the standard of tolerance to them is an objective duty. So even though they affirm relativism, they're saying anyone who doesn't affirm it is wrong. So it's very difficult. We don't, in fact, like most discussions that you have with someone about whether objective moral values and duties do exist, there's always this loop around where they'll make objective or absolute statements, and they'll claim that something is true. Now, whether the objective value that they're identifying is actually true or not, like in this case with the tolerance example, it may not be the case. They may have identified a value that you don't think is actually true. But we can't avoid language that objectively applies values and duties to everyone, regardless of their culture or what time they live in or what their personal preference is. So this is an interesting argument, I think, because of most people will agree with it, and even if they don't agree with it, they generally are going to use language that actually agrees with it, and it's something that you can point out. And so it's a really good place to start. And you're not asking, well, can people be good without believing in God? We know that there are people, even the Bible affirms, like Jesus talks about, even the Gentiles know how to treat their children well. There's things that people recognize as being good, and there's people that do live pretty good lives without believing in God. And there's actually some people that kind of put Christians to shame because they live better moral lives than some Christians. And so we need to make sure we avoid that. The way that the arguments are presented, sometimes people can get on guard and be like, well, I'm a good person, or are you saying I can't be good without believing in God? And that's not how this argument is actually worded. It is, if God does not exist, do we actually have a grounding for our moral values and duties? And even if you don't use the word objective or moral values and duties, you can use language that's really conversational, and it's easy to have a conversation about it or start a conversation about this argument without being like, well, let me tell you about the moral argument, because you can just start talking about, well, why do you think that's good? Why do you think that doing this action is good? And how can we measure the good of different societies if we don't have a standard outside of those societies? And you can kind of start there and work your way into the argument in a conversation that way. Okay, so the last conclusion is that therefore God exists. Okay, because objective moral values and duties do exist, and we need a standard for those values and duties. Therefore, God exists. Now, there are some other objections, like moral Platonism and a few others, and I welcome you to check out the handout to read more about that. Like I said, we don't have enough time to dig too deep on those. I wanted to end on this verse. So when Gentiles who do not by nature have the law do what the law demands, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts. Their conscience confirms this. Consciences confirm this. Their competing thoughts either accuse or even excuse them. Okay, so we have this idea in Christianity given to us that the work of the law is written on their hearts. The law of the Lord is written on our hearts, and we're held to a standard, and we're aware of this objective moral experience. And that doesn't mean we always know the right or wrong thing to do. There's other things that get in and muck up the works, but when you think about, like your vision, you can't always experience, you don't always experience the world seeing clearly. Some people see more clearly than others and things like that. And we can kind of take some of those, that way we talk about the senses, and kind of apply it to this moral reality and describe our moral experience. And people do have this reaction of, hey, that's not just if you steal something from them, or something is done that is wrong. They immediately go to that there is an objective wrong that's happened to me. And so this is a great, I think it is one of the best arguments to use kind of in our society right now, because people agree with this. If they're wrong, they believe it's wrong. And so where does that belief come from? Where does that moral experience come from? And we can start a conversation on that. All right, so we'll see if we have any questions here. Looks like Bo asked a question. So his question is, though God is the objective standard, is there some flexibility in which God allows some things based on development and growth through evolution and social convention, kind of like as we learn more of who God is and what he wants, then more is asked of us, morally speaking. Okay, so that question kind of has two facets there. And I mean, what I did read in that verse just now is a little bit describing that people are held to the standard of the knowledge that they have. As Christians, we do believe that the Bible talks about that, based on what revelation that they're given. That's the measure or the standard that they're going to be held to. And then as far as things based on development and growth, I'm not sure if I'm following the question perfectly. But I think we as societies would argue that. So there may be societies that argue, well, we are more developed, and they kind of look down on other societies. And I think there is some, because it's written on our hearts, I think it is something that can be discovered. It's a standard that can be discovered out there, that even a person without the revelation of God in the Bible can develop into a more moral person by probing those experiences. And we do have a branch of ethical studies, and even our business and different what's the word I'm looking for? Different fields of study have ethics in them, and people thinking about those ethics. And I would say that not all of them are religious. Now, I think we have a shortcut in the revelation of God, just like that verse talks about. The Gentiles didn't have the full law, but we do. We have this revelation that gives us a lot more information and gives us a further down the road starting point on understanding our moral experience and identifying the values and duties that do exist. in the standard of God. But I think some things can't be explored, and I think we can see that in history, in the writings of different cultures across the earth. There are shared, um, and I would say because they're objective and they can be experienced, they're shared moral values where they evaluate, oh yeah, this is right and this is wrong. Um, so I would say yes. Hopefully, I'm answering that question correctly, though, because a little bit, I'm a little bit confused, a little bit tripped up on it, but we can talk about that later. Um, so I think that's going to be it for today. It's 9:50. We're heading, a bunch of people are heading to, I think, the church to do the drive-in experience today. So I hope if you're going to that you have a good time kind of waving at people in their cars, and we'll see how it works. And if not, I believe there is a uh, premiere service happening on YouTube still at 10:30, so you can check out pvcc.info for that service. And again, if you have any other questions or thoughts about these arguments or any of the things we've talked about, join that GroupMe discussion and get a hold of me, and we can talk about them further. I can point you to other resources. So let's just close in prayer and we'll let everyone go. Heavenly Father, thank you for a beautiful May morning, and I pray that we can uh, take these arguments that people have observed over the years, and we can use them to share your good news, to share the nature of reality and your saving grace with other people around us. Uh, Help us to grow in wisdom and to pursue your word and knowledge of you further. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a great week, everybody.